I need to stop, like, screwing around with the things before frame. Yeah, so we're going to be doing reading first, and then we're going to play some RimWorld, because I tend to remember to do that. Late start to the stream. I am. I know how I am. So, I'm going to try and get through this chunk. So property rights and theory of contracts is what I'm going to get through today. Oh boy. Right? No. Maybe? No. Rights. Bribery, the boycott. Oh, I need to figure out what page must be on. Bribery. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we read the boycott. Yeah, we read the boycott. Theory of contracts, yeah. Bada bing. I need to get music going. And then you should be on the other monitor. Why are you zooping over? The monitor is supposed to be. How the fuck did you zoop over? I changed. I don't know. Maybe I minimized it. Anyway, property rights and the theory of contracts. The right to private property implies the right to make contracts about that property, give it away, or to exchange titles of ownership of the property or of another person. If the volume's too loud, feel free to say so. Unfortunately, many libertarians devoted to the right to make contract itself to be an absolute, and therefore maintain that any voluntary contract, whatever, must be legally enforced by society. Their error, a failure to realize that the right to contract is strictly derivable from the right of private property, and therefore that the only enforceable contracts, i.e. those backed by the sanction of legal coercion, should be those where the failure of one party to abide by the contract implies the theft of property from the other party. In short, a contract should only be enforceable when the failure to fulfill it is an implicit theft of property. But this can only be true if we hold that validly enforced contracts exist where title to property has already been transferred, and therefore with the failure to abide by the contract, that the other party's property is retained by the delinquent party without the consent of the theft. Hence, this proper libertarian theory of contracts has been termed the title transfer theory of contracts. But like labor contracts. I'm sure I'll get to that, but it's, that's the immediate thing. I guess you are trading body time. Has Rothbard talked about body time, or is that just the thing Hopper talks about? Let us illustrate this point. Suppose that Smith and Jones make a contract. Smith gives $1,000 to Jones at the present moment in exchange for an IOU of Jones, agreeing to pay Smith $1,100 1 year from now. This is a typical debt contract. What has happened is that Smith has transferred his title to ownership of $1,000 at present in exchange for Jones agreeing now to transfer title of $1,100 1 year from now. Suppose that, when the appointed date arrives 1 year later, Jones refuses. Why should this payment now be enforced at libertarian law? Existing law, which will be dealt with in greater detail below, largely contends that Jones must pay $1,100 he has promised to pay. That this promise set up in Smith's mind the expectation he would receive. Our contention here is that mere promises are not a transfer of property title, that while it may well be the moral thing to keep one's promises, that it is not and cannot be the function of law, i.e. legal violence, in a libertarian system of morality, in this case the promises. Our contention here is that Jones must pay Smith $1,100 because he had already agreed to transfer title, and that non-payment means that Jones is a thief, that he has stolen the property of Smith. In short, Smith's original transfer of the $1,000 was absolute but conditional. Conditional on Jones paying the $1,100, and that, therefore, the failure to pay is an implicit theft of Smith's rightful property. Let us examine, on the other hand, the implications of the now prevalent promise or expectations theory of contracts. Suppose that A promises to marry B. B proceeds to make wedding plans, incurring costs of preparing for the wedding. At the last minute, A changes his or her mind, thereby violating this alleged contract. What should be the role of a legal enforcement agency in libertarian society? Logically, a strict believer in the promise theory of this contract have to reason as follows. A voluntarily promised B that he or she would marry the other. This set up the expectation of marriage in the other's mind. Therefore, this contract must be enforced. A must be B. As far as we know, no one has pushed the promise theory this far. Compulsory marriage is such a clear and evident form of involuntary slavery that no theorist, let alone any libertarian, has pushed the logic to. Clearly, liberty and compulsory slavery are totally incompatible. Indeed, are diametric opposites. But why not, if all promises must be in contract? A milder form of enforcing such marriage promises has, however, been employed, let alone advocated, in our legal system. The old breach of promise forced the violator of his promise to pay damages to the promisee, pay the expenses gone because of the expectations. But while this does not go as far as compulsory slavery, it's equally invalid. For there can be no property in someone's promise or expectations. These are only subjective states of mind, which do not involve transfer of title, and therefore do not involve implicit theft. They therefore should not be enforced, and in recent years, promise suits, at least, have ceased upheld by the court. The important point is that while enforcement of damages is scarcely as horrendous to the libertarian as compulsory enforcement of promised service, it stems from the same invalid principle. Let us pursue more deeply our argument that mere promises or expectations should not be enforced. The basic reason is that the only valid transfer of title of ownership in society is the case where the property is, in fact and in the nature of man, alienable by man. All physical property owned by a person is alienable, i.e., in natural fact, it can be given or transferred to the ownership and control of another party. I can give away or sell to another person my shoe, my house, my car, my money, etc. But there are certain vital things which, in natural fact and in the nature of man, are inalienable, i.e., they cannot in fact be alienated, even voluntarily. Specifically, a person cannot alienate his will, more particularly his control over his own mind and body. Each man has control over his own mind and body. Each man has control over his own will and person, and he is, if you wish, stuck that inherent and inalienable ownership. Since his will and control over his own person are inalienable, then so also are his rights to control that person and will. That is the famous position of the Declaration of Independence, that man's natural rights are inalienable. That is, they cannot be surrendered even if the person wishes to do so. Or, as Williamson Evers points out, the philosophical defense of humanity are founded upon the natural fact that each is the proprietor of his own will. Take rights like those of property and actual freedom that are based on a foundation of the absolute self-ownership of the will, and then to use those derived rights to destroy their own foundation is philosophically invalid. Hence, the unenforceability in libertarian theory of voluntary slave contracts. Suppose that Smith makes the following agreement with Jones Corporation. Smith, for the rest of his life, will obey all orders, under whatever conditions, that the Jones Corporation wishes to lay down. Now, in libertarian theory, there is nothing to prevent Smith from serving the Jones Corporation, and from obeying the latter's orders indefinitely. The problem comes when, at some later date, Smith changes his mind and decides to leave. Shall he be held to his former voluntary promise? Our contention, and one that is fully upheld under present law, is that Smith's promise was not a valid, i.e. not an enforceable, contract. There is no transfer of title in the agreement. Smith's control over his own body will inalienable. That control cannot be alienated. The agreement was not a valid contract, and therefore should not be enforced. Smith's agreement was a mere promise, which it might be held he is morally obligated, but which should not be legally obligatory. In fact, to enforce the promise would be just as much compulsory slavery as the compulsory marriage considered. But should Smith at least be required to pay damages to the Jones Corporation, measured by the expectations of his lifelong service which Jones Corporation had required? Again, the answer must be no. Smith is not an thief. He has retained no just property of the Jones Corporation, for he always retained title to his own body and person. What of the dashed expectations of the Jones Corporation? The answer must be the same as in the case of the bride. Life is always uncertain, always risky. Some people are better and some are poorer on, i.e. forecasters of future human action and events of the world. The prospective bride or bridegroom or the Jones Corporation are the proper locus of risk. If their expectations are disappointed, well then, they were forecasters, and they will remember the experience when dealing with Smith or of marriage promise in the future. Breacher of marriage promise is an insanely long, unwieldy term. I don't know why they... Would-be groom. I don't know. If mere promises or expectations cannot be enforced, only contracts that transfer property titles, you can now see the application of the contrasting contract theories. An important real-life case. Do enlistee deserters from the army, as well as draftees, deserve total amnesty for their actions? Libertarians, being opposed to the draft as compulsory slavery, have no difficulty in calling for total exoneration of deserting draftees. But what of enlistees who enlisted in the army voluntarily, and setting aside the case of those who may have enlisted as an alternative draft? Promise theorists must strictly advocate both punishment of the deserters and their compulsory return to the armed forces. Title transfer theorist, on the contrary, maintains that every man has the inalienable right to control his own body and will, since he has that innate control in natural, and therefore that the enlistment was a mere promise which cannot be enforced. Every man has the right to change his mind at any time over the disposition of body and will. Thus, seemingly minor and abstruse differences over the theory of contracts can and do imply vital differences in public policy. In contemporary America, outside the glaring exception of armed forces, everyone has the right to quit his job regardless of whatever promise or contract he had previously incurred. Fortunately, however, the courts, while refusing to compel specific personal employee agreement, refusing to enslave the worker, do prohibit the worker from working at a similar task for another employer for the term of the agreement. If someone has signed an agreement to work as an engineer for Aramco for 5 years, and he then quits the job, he is prohibited by the court looking for a similar employer the remainder of the 5 years. It should now be clear that this prohibited employment is only one step removed from strict compulsory slavery, that it should be completely impossible libertarian. Have the employers then no recourse to try and change it? Of course they do. They can, if they wish, voluntarily agree to blacklist the errant worker, refuse to employ him. That is perfectly within their rights in a society. What is not within their rights is violence to prevent him from working voluntarily for someone else. One more recourse would be permissible. Suppose that Smith, when making his agreement for lifelong voluntary obedience to the Jones Corporation, receives in exchange $1 million in payment for these expected future services. Clearly then, the Jones Corporation had transferred title to the $1 million, not absolutely, but conditionally on his of lifelong. Yay, debt slavery time. Smith has the absolute right to change his mind. but he no longer has the right to keep the $1 million. If he does so, he is a thief of the Jones Corporation's property. He must, therefore, be forced to return the $1 million plus interest. For, of course, the title to the money was and remains alienable. Let us take a seemingly more difficult case. Suppose that a celebrated movie actor agrees to appear at a certain theater at a certain date. For whatever reason, he fails to appear. Should he be forced to appear at that or at some future date? Certainly not, for that would be compulsory slavery. He would be forced at least to recompense the theater owners for the publicity and other expenses incurred by the theater owners of his appearance. No, again, for his agreement was a mere promise concerning his inalienable will. He has the right to change at any time. Put another way, since the movie actor has not yet received any of the theater owner's property, he has committed no theft against the owners or against anyone else, and therefore he cannot be forced to pay damages. The fact that the theater owners may have made plans and investments on the expectation that the actor would keep the agreement may be unfortunate for the owners, but that is their proper risk. Theater owners should not expect the actor to be forced to pay their lack of foresight and poor entrepreneur. Rough. That is rough. The owners pay the penalty for placing too much confidence in the actor. It may be considered more moral to keep promises and break them, but any coercive enforcement of such a moral code goes beyond the prohibition of theft or assault, is itself an invasion of the property rights of the movie actor, and therefore Again, of course, if the actor received an advance payment from the theater owners, then his keeping the money while not fulfilling his part of the contract would be an implicit theft against the owners, and therefore the actor must be forced to return the money. For utilitarians shocked at the consequences of this doctrine, it should be noted that many, if not all, of the promises clearly surmounted in the libertarian society. In short, if the theater owners wished to avoid the risk of non-appearance, they could refuse to sign the agreement unless the actor agreed to put up a performance in case of non-appearance. Valid. Yeah. Go off, King. They could refuse to sign the agreement. In that case, the actor, in the course of agreeing to his future appearance, agrees also to transfer a certain sum of money to the theater owner in case he fails to appear. Since money, of course, is alienable, since such a contract would meet our title transfer criterion, this would be a perfectly valid and For what the actor would be saying is, if I do not appear at Theatre X at such and such a date, I hereby transfer, as of the date, the following sum, theatre owners. Failure to meet the performance bond will then be an implicit theft of the property of the owners. If then the theatre owners fail to require a performance bond as part of the agreement, then they must suffer the consequence. Indeed, in an important article, AWB has pointed out that performance bonds were the rule during the Middle Ages and in the early modern, not only for personal services, but for all contracts and sales of land and money. These performance bonds evolved on the market as voluntary penalty or penal bonds. The contractor obligated himself to pay what was twice the sum he owed in case of failure to pay his debt or for contract at the agreement. That sounds fun. One of my books to read. Let's see. AWB Simpson. The penal bond with conditional defeasance. Quarterly review 966. I wonder how hard some of those would be to find. Sounds fun. I hate that it sounds fun because it tells you what kind of person I am. The voluntary contracted penalty served as an incentive for him to fulfill his contract. Thus, if A agreed to sell a parcel of land in exchange for B's agreed upon payment of a money price, each would obligate himself to pay a certain sum, twice the value of his contractual obligation, in case of failure to pay. In the case of a money debt, called a common money bond, someone who owed $1,000 agreed to pay $2,000 to the creditor if he failed to pay $1,000 by a certain date. Or more strictly, the obligation to pay $2,000 was additional $1,000 by a certain date. Hence the term additional. In the above example, a contract for personal services, suppose that the failure of the actor to appear cost the debtor owner $10,000 in damage. In that case, the actor would sign or execute a penal performance bond, agreeing to pay $20,000 to the debtor owner for failure to appear. In this sort of contract, the debtor owner is protected, and there is no improper enforcement of a mere promise. Of course, the agreed upon penalty have to be twice the estimated value. It can be any amount assented to by the contracting parties. The double amount became the custom in early modern Europe. In the course of this article, revises the orthodox historical account of modern contract law. The view that the theory of assumpsit, of basing the enforcement of a contract upon a mere promise, albeit with consideration, was necessary to provide a workable contract enforcement in supplement to the property rights of the common law. For Simpson shows that the rise of assumpsit in the 16th and 17th was not the result of newfound attention to the world of business, but rather a replacement for the rapid decline of the had served business needs well enough for. Indeed, Simpson points out that the performance bond proved a remarkably flexible handling of complex as well as simple contract and the performance bond was formal enough to guard against, yet easy enough to execute action. Furthermore, in its centuries of use, almost no creditors bothered to damages in a writ of covenant, since the damages had been fixed in advance in the contract itself. As Simpson writes, there are obvious attractions from a creditor's point in contracts which fix a penalty in advance, especially when the alternative is assessment of damages by juries. But why the decline of the penal bond? Because the courts began to refuse to enforce those obligations. For whatever the reason, whether for misguided humanitarian or for more sinister special privilege, the courts began to balk at the toughness of the law, at the fact that they had been enforcing contracts to their extent. The bond meant that any default in performance, all penalties. At first, during the Elizabethan era, courts of chancery began intervening to relieve the debtor, obligor, in cases of extreme hardship. By the early 17th century, this relief broadened to all cases in which his fortune fell the obligor, and where he paid the contracted amount a short time later. In such cases, he only had to pay the principal, contracted amount, plus what the courts decided were, thus waiving the requirement to pay the paid-on penalty. Intervention expanded further in later years until, finally, in the 50s and early 16th, chancery courts simply outlawed penalty payment altogether. Whatever the contract, and only required the defaulting obligor and debtor pay the principal plus interest cost, as well as reasonable damages, assessed by the court itself, by a jury. This rule was swiftly adopted by the court in the 1670s, and then formalized and regularized by statutes at the turn of the 18th. Naturally, since bonded penalties were no longer enforced by the courts, the institution of the penal performance bond swiftly the unfortunate suppression of the performance bond was the result of a mistaken theory of contract enforcement courts had adopted in the first place, namely that the purpose of enforcement was to compensate the debtor or obligee the default of the debtor, i.e., to make him as well off as he would have been without the. In previous centuries, courts had felt that compensation consisted of enforcing the penal bond. It then became fairly easy for the courts to change their minds and to decide that court-assessed damages were compensation enough, leaving the harshness of the voluntarily stipulated. The theory of contract enforcement could have had nothing to do with compensation. Its purpose should always be to enforce property rights and to guard against the theft of breaking contracts which transfer titles to alienable property. Defense of property titles, and only such defense, is the business of enforcement agents. Writes perceptively of the tension between two ideas. On one hand, we have the idea that the real function of contractual institutions is to ensure, so far as possible, that agreements are performed, be the enforcement of the. On the other hand, we have the idea that it suffices for the court to provide compensation for loss suffered by failure to perform. That's a fascinating one. Oh well. The latter view places severe limits on the enthusiasm with which performance is required. Moreover, in contracts for personal services, such as the actor example above, a positive value is attached to the right to break the contract, so long as the defaulting party is made to pay compensation. What of gift contracts? Should they be legally enforceable? Again, the answer depends on whether a mere promise has been made, whether an actual transfer of title has taken place. Obviously, if A says to B, "I hereby give you $10,000, then title to the money has been transferred, and the gift is enforced. A, furthermore, cannot later demand the money back as his right. On the other hand, if A says, "I promise to give you $10,000 in 1 year, then this is a mere promise, what used to be called a nudum pactum, Roman law, and therefore is not properly a promise." That's interesting. They call them naked as well. The receiver must take his chances that the donor will. But if, on the contrary, A tells B, oh no, that's, why do I keep coming back? I think it's because I look away. Oh, buzzes up, fogs up. It should be emphasized that this is not mere wordplay, much as it might seem so in particular. For the important question is always at stake: has title to alienable property been transferred, or has a mere promise been granted? In the former case, the agreement is enforced. A failure to deliver transferred property is theft. In the latter case, it is a mere promise which has not transferred title to property, a promise that may be morally binding but cannot be legally binding on the promisor. Hobbes was not engaging in mere wordplay. He correctly wrote, gotta wet the throat for this. So I got mold all over my glasses because it's bad at me. Cranking one out. Game that did not do very well. Because it's sugar water. How to place these some. Recognize this gently. Pennsylvania? I need to know. 38. I have the Killer Queen, right? Right. Words alone, if they be of the time to come, and contain a bare promise, are an insufficient sign of a free gift, and therefore not obligatory. Or, if they be of the time to come, as tomorrow I will give, they are a sign I have not yet given, consequently, that my right is not transferred, remaineth, till I transfer it by some other act. But if the words be of the time present, or past, as I have given, give to be delivered tomorrow, and this is my tomorrow's right given away today. The great difference in the signification of words between I will that this be thine tomorrow and I will give it thee tomorrow. For the word I will in the former manner of speech signifies a promise of an act of the will present, but in the latter it signifies a promise of an act of the will to come. And therefore, former words being of the present transfer a future right, the latter that be of the future transfer nothing. Thank you, Hobbes. Let us now apply the contrasting theories to a pure gift agreement, rather than exchange. A grandfather promises to pay his grandson's way through college. After a year or two in college, the grandfather, whether from suffering business reverses, or from any other reason, decides to revoke his promise. On the basis of the promise, the grandson has incurred various expenses arranging his college career and foregoing other employment. Should the grandson be able to enforce his father's promise through action? In our title transfer, the grandson has no right whatever to the grandfather's property, since the grandfather retained title to it. A mere naked promise can confer no title, and neither can. objective expectations of the property. Costs incurred by the grandson are properly his own entrepreneur. On the other hand, of course, if the grandfather transferred title, then it would be the grandson's property, should be able to sell his property. Such a transfer would have occurred if the grandfather had written, "I hereby transfer $8,000 to you, the grandson," or had written, "I hereby transfer $2,000 to you at each of the following dates: 1st of September 1975, 1st of September 1970. On the other hand, on the expectations model of contracts, there are two possible variants. Either that the grandson would have a binding legal claim on the father because of the mere promise, or that the grandson would have a claim on the expenses that he had incurred on the expectation of the promise. Suppose, however, that the original statement of the grandfather was not a simple promise, but a conditional exchange. The grandfather agreed to pay the grandson's full college tuition, provided that the grandson make weekly progress reports to the father. In that case, according to our title transfer theory, the grandfather has made a conditional transfer of title, agreeing to transfer title in the future provided that the grandson performed certain services. If the grandson in fact performed such services, continues to perform, then the tuition payment is property and should be entitled to collect from the grandfather. Under our proposed theory, would fraud be actionable at law? Yes, because fraud is failure to fulfill a voluntarily agreed upon transfer of property, and is therefore implicit theft. If, for example, A sells to B a package A says contains a radio, and it contains only a pile of scrap metal, then A has taken B's money and fulfilled the agreement. A has therefore stolen B's property. Same applies to a failure to fulfill any product warranty. If, for example, the seller asserts that the contents of include 5 ounces of X, and they do not do so, the seller has taken money without fulfilling the terms of the contract, has in effect stolen the buyer's money. Once again, warranties of products would be legally enforced, not because they are promises, but because they describe one of the entities of the agreed upon. If the entity is not as the seller describes, then fraud and hence implicit theft have taken place. Would bankruptcy laws be permissible in a libertarian legal system? Clearly not, for the bankruptcy laws compel the discharge of a debtor's voluntarily contracted debts, and thereby invade the property rights of the creditors. The debtor who refuses to pay his debt has stolen the property of the If the debtor is able to pay but conceals his assets, then his fair act of theft is compounded by fraud. But even if the defaulting debtor is not able to pay, he has still stolen the property of the creditor by not making his agreed upon delivery of the creditor's property. The function of the legal system should be to force payment upon the debtor through e.g. forced attachment of the debtor's future income for the debt plus the damages and interest. Bankruptcy laws, which discharge the debt in defiance of the property rights of the creditor, virtually confer a license on the debtor. In the pre-modern era, defaulting debtor was generally treated as a thief to pay as he acquired income. Doubtless, the penalty of imprisonment was far beyond proportional punishment, and hence was excessive, but at least the old legal ways placed responsibility where it belonged, on the debtor to fulfill his contractual obligations and to make the transfer of the property owed to creditor-owner. One historian of American bankruptcy law, though a supporter of these laws, has conceded that they trample property rights of creditors. If the laws of bankruptcy were based on the legal rights of individuals, there would be no warrant for the discharge of debtors from the payment of their debts as long as they lived, or their estates would. The creditor has rights which must not be violated, even if adversity bankrupts condition. His claims are part of his property. In defense of bankruptcy law, the utilitarian economist might reply that once these laws are on the books, the creditor knows what may happen to him, that he compensates for that extra risk with a higher interest, and that therefore actions under the bankruptcy law should not be regarded as expropriation of the creditor's property. It is true that the creditor knows the law in advance, that he will charge a higher interest rate for the therefore, however, does not at all follow. Regardless of all foreknowledge or forewarning, bankruptcy laws are still violations, expropriations of property rights of the creditors. There are all sorts of situations in the market where prospective victims may be able to maneuver so as to minimize the harm to themselves of institutionalized theft. The theft is no more moral or legitimate because of such praiseworthy maneuvers. Moreover, the same utilitarian argument could be used about such crimes as murder. Instead of deploring crime against certain sections of a city, might then argue, as utilitarian, as follows: after all, storekeepers knew that they were doing in advance before they opened the store. They knew of the higher crime rate at that location and were therefore able to adjust their insurance and their business practices accordingly. Should we say, therefore, that robbery of stores is not to be outlawed? In short, crime is crime, and invasions of property are invasions of property. Why should those far-seeing property owners, some advanced measures, mitigate the effects of prospective crime, be penalized by being deprived of a legal defense of their justly owned property? Why should the law penalize the virtue or thought? The problem of defaulting debtors may be met in another way. The creditor, taking account of the debtor's honest attempts to pay, may voluntarily decide to forgive part or all of the debt. Here it is important to stress that in a libertarian system which defends property rights, each creditor may only forgive his own debt, may only surrender his own property claims to the debtor. There can be no legal situation in which a majority of creditors tell a minority to forgive their own. Voluntary forgiveness of a debt may occur after the fact of default, or it may be incorporated into the original debt contract. In that case, A could lend B $1,000 now in exchange for $1,000 a year from now, provided that, given certain conditions of unavoidable insolvency, A would forgive B part or all of that debt. Presumably, A would charge a higher interest rate for the additional failure. But the important point is that in these situations of forgiveness, discharge of debt has been voluntarily agreed upon, either in the agreement or after default by the original creditor. Voluntary forgiveness takes on the legal philosophical status of a gift by the creditor to the debtor. Oddly enough, while title transfer theorists see such a gift as a perfectly legitimate and valid transfer title to money from a creditor to a debtor, current legal doctrine question the validity of such an agreement to give as a binding contract. For, in current theory, a binding contract must be a promise exchanged for a consideration. In case of forgiveness, the creditor receives no consideration in exchange, but the title transfer. No problems with forgiveness. The creditor's act by way of releasing a claim is of the same kind as an ordinary act of transfer. In either case, the act is manifested consent of the. Another important point in our title transfer model, a person should be able to sell not only the full title of ownership to property, but also part of that property, retaining the rest for himself or others to whom he grants or sells that part of the title. Thus, as we have seen above, common law copyright is justified as the author or publisher selling all rights to his property except the right to Similarly valid and enforceable the restrictive covenants to property in which, for example, a developer sells all the rights to a house and land to a purchaser except for the right to build a house over a certain or of other than a certain design. The only proviso is that there must at every time be some existing owner or owners of all the rights to any given property. In the case of a restrictive covenant, for example, there must be some owners of the reserved right to build a tall building, if not the developer himself, someone who has bought or received the right. If the reserved right has been abandoned, no existing possesses it, then the owner of the house may be considered to have homesteaded this right, and can then go ahead and build. Covenants and other restrictions, in short, cannot simply run with the property forever, thereby overriding the wishes of all living owners of that property. This proviso rules out entail as right. Under entail, a property owner could bequeath this land to his sons and grandsons, with the proviso that no future sell the land outside the family, a deed typical of feudalism. But this would mean that the living owners could not sell the property. They would be governed by the dead hand of the past. But all rights to any property must be in the hands of living. Might be considered a moral requirement for tenants to keep the land in the family, but it cannot properly be considered a legal obligation. Property rights must only be accorded to and can only be enjoyed by the living. There is at least one case in which promised expectations is in grave contradiction, depending upon whether one stresses the promise or the expectations part of the theory. This is the legal problem of whether purchase breaks hire. Suppose that Smith owns a tract of land. He leases the land for 5 years to Jones. Smith, however, now sells the land to Robinson. Is Robinson bound to obey the terms of the... Can he oust Jones immediately? On the promise theory, only Smith made the promise to lease the land. Robinson did not so promise, and therefore Robinson is not bound to respect the lease. On the expectations theory, the lease agreement generated expectations the land would be 5 years. Therefore, on the former grounds, it just breaks higher. Whereas it cannot do so on the expectations model. Title transfer theory, however, avoids this problem. On our model, Jones, the leaseholder, owns the use of property for the contractual period of the lease. 5 years of property has been transferred to Jones. Therefore, Robinson cannot break the lease, unless, of course, breaking of hire under such conditions was expressly included as a provision. There is one vitally important political implication of our title transfer, as against the promise theory of valid and it should be clear that the title transfer theory immediately tosses out of court all variants of the social contract theory as a justification for the state. Well, duh, obviously. You don't need to get into the weeds about this. I don't think anyone here believes in social contract. Bit nonsense. Setting aside the historical problem of whether such a social contract ever took place, it should be evident that the social contract, whether it be the Hobbesian surrender of all one's rights, Lockean surrender of the right of self-defense, or any other, a mere promise of future behavior and future will, and in no way surrender title to alienable property. Certainly no past promise can bind later generations, let alone the actual maker of the promise. Current law of contracts is an inchoate mixture of the title transfer and the promise expectations of the expectations model predominating under the 19th century legal positivism pragmatism. A libertarian natural rights, property rights theory must therefore reconstitute contract law on the proper title transfer basis. How long's Lifeboat? Pages. I'm feeling Rimworld now already. It's, you know what? I titled it Anarchist Reading Hour. So that's the hour done. 56 minutes. Oh well. There's a dense chapter, 16 pages. Man, ugh. Pages, talking about contracts. Good talking about contracts, but like, man. Okay, Rimworld launched up. Let's pause this, let's switch over the category. I'm not gonna switch over the title. Love me some Rimworld. Why? Stop zoom into that screen. Why that comes up. Anyway. Rimworld time. The game. I was the Eagle Confederation. But anyway, I added some mods, I removed a mod. Designated Shapes was screwing me up. I think they just added designated shapes to the game. You know how it is. Acting. Once Eagle gets over her food sickness, she gets over it, not recovers enough to walk. I'm gonna zone expand home area. Turn off auto expand home area. I grab more weed. Alright, we got this person's getting their assault. Oh yeah. I have no idea what they're doing. 5 hours death. And there's Minute, right? Okay. Oh, good news. This is a perfectly fine room to be. Yep. That's nice. Oh, medicine too. Open light. And Albrola, right? I didn't want to guy anyway. But maybe crafting's really useful. And how self-tame? Prioritize. Even hamster. Purple. Place clean. The light label. Oh, nice. Good stool. Let's research project. Hmm. I'm cutting. That'll be very useful. Holding stuff. Caveman. I haven't tried activating. Like, meals last a while. It'll make. That's a priority. Opinion. I'm gonna check. Go, just give. Alpha Rumbo. Oh. Kill him. Go save this. Mindfully off fire risk. I'm not gonna get him to cut the thing's neck. I'm mindful of it. It looks so bad naked. You need light rice plant. Architect would very annoying. Oh, I want pemmican now though. Let's go without pemmican. Orange shoes. Pick make own. Party. I need you guys to fucking work though. Yeesh. Everyone's yeah, productive. No harm in just growing in excess of slower thing to grow. I so don't know anything about the traps. Okay, so that's how they work. Survival pellet? Wooden floor. Room doesn't have any doorways. Yep. A critical storage. May as well. Malnutrition. Why the fuck am I feeling? Wooden? Wooden? I just hadn't been setting them to. Sorry, I forgot to set a wooden. Guinea pig. Has to be eagle. High power. Quest. Yep. Ah, right. Okay. Social. Just like we did. Gotta do it. Phone is going. This is. Pestering me about some nonsense. Not asleep. Question. You know what I mean. She's dead. Cool. Why are you doing that to yourself? You have weed. Go down to... That was just in... Oh, yeah. Huh. That zone... Okay, we got a little room here. Nothing in it. We should start giving you guys individual bedrooms. Let's see. Put up this room. Fridge. Nice. Huzzah, we're getting food. Mountains and mountains of edible stuff. Huh. fuck? Alright, I'm not taking bullshit. I'm accepting the 20% brain function. Arguably worse. Arguably worse, we're taking it. We have to care for eagles now. Where are the hunters? Like the mate. I hate how slow this cooking is, man. I'm trying to get bills. I don't eat vegetarian. Smoke leaf is definitely not going to help her be on her feet. Structure. Oh, good. They made ancient pipeline sections destructible. But these things only 30%. No priest. listen to our... Yeah. Control chain, triple. Dajma, I assume needs... Really? No clue. Major break risk. Breaks. Alright. Resurrecting again. Okay, there we go. Ooh, crush heart. Hey. Constant break risk. Improve that. In. On the ground. Kids. Raid. Avigo League. Grounder. Iron Willed. Hell yeah. Mining. Esculin Cult. New enemies. Male Supremacy. Unwaveringly. Kennel wasn't disapproved. Doesn't. Approach. Take travel with. And hamster. 33 seconds. Dead. Cybercon. It's Cybercons are very awful, so little that. Why is Volcanic Ash ugly? Where's walls? All the thing. Because, you know, things that. But, 5%. I'm confused. Oh well. Stuff here. Things to look. A lot of steel. Has done that. Man. Levels and numbers. Bruh. The vision recruitment. Open is be one of my people. Is we can do construction as well. Rice stockpiled. Purple's brother. Oh, yo, wait, purple defected from Manporkers? Flash mask. What other ideology? Already kept if I can find. The stupid. Okay, just that. Tell these who's not doing. Eh. Hmm. And hoping they don't go through. What do you like? Psychopath, bull, brawler. Animals, good with melee. Decent. Not a very good guy. Something's wrong with you. You're very old, got it. Oh. So you got a 60% manipulation. Is it worth killing you for anything? Oh well. Too late to try. God, I need to be colder here. Who would have thought volcano too hot? Why is this building so much hotter? Ah. Pressurized. Yeah, it's gonna be annoying as well. Yeah, 26 is good build. That was well. The wood. How was this growing? Yeesh. Gee, thanks, guy. Seed, please. Yeah. I've never noticed passive coolers doing that much. So it is cooler indoors and outdoors now. Hmm. Such a painter. Stone cutting's almost done. And now I can research. I can just cook like electricity and get electricity down because I've got the thing that's giving me 3200 right now. Furniture, beds, styling station. Electricity means I don't get air conditioning. Right. But it means I'll get air conditioning pretty soon. We have big research underway. Oh, I'm getting garbage. Manage drug policies, social recreation. Oh, that's the issue. Table. I hate making metal furniture. awkward feeling. That needs aren't, so... What? Oh, not terribly long. Eagle. Thank you. Middle table. Middle line. The occasion. I'm just... I'm in a fairly good position. I just need to wait on this research. There we go. That'll work. That'll be Dolphin's job. Close number 6. Honestly, the reading today took so much steam. Bullet here.